As I lay flat on my back, wondering if I'd ever breathe again, I questioned my recent choices. I was a truck driver by day. I drove one of the smaller box trucks making deliveries. But that didn't keep me off the interstates. Twice a week I took the long trip for supplies. Driving on the interstate with all the idiots made me want to do terrible things to people. Like when some grandma was sitting in the passing lane for an hour with her cruise control set on 47 and no one could pass her. When I got to a city, the traffic intensified. Being stuck with the other 4 lanes of law-abiding traffic for a half hour and watching helplessly as these arrogant drivers in their BMWs and Mercedes decided to pass everyone on the berm because they're too important to wait like the rest of us, made me think of doing some bodily harm to some idiot drivers. As I was heading back from my stressful trip, this idiot in a big rig decided that I was in his lane. I saw the tires getting closer as he changed lanes with no signal. I slammed on the brakes to keep from being pushed off the road at 70 miles per hour. Did he stop? No. Did he even slow or flash his lights in recognition that he'd done anything wrong? Of course not. I stared in rage at the truck that was pulling away from me, and suddenly I felt my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. I caught up to him and honked my horn so he would look at me. Then I gave him the finger and swerved into his lane. He swerved away from me. I didn't need to be able to read lips to tell the kind of language he was using. He swerved back and I had to go into the passing lane to avoid him. In doing so, I almost sideswiped a minivan I hadn't noticed. They managed to avoid me, but that was when I came to my senses and realized what I was doing. I hit the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. I put the truck in park and turned it off. I sat there shaking at the thought of how dangerous and stupid I'd been. It was then I realized I needed a vacation. It had been 2 years since I'd taken one, and the incident showed me that the job was getting to me. I had lots of time to think about it, and I knew exactly where I wanted to go. You know how there are things you always want to do, but you put them off because you don't have time. That was the thing I planned on doing to regain my perspective. I used to live in a small town when I was a kid. We lived on a side road of town where there wasn't much traffic, but we could see downtown and the main bridge crossing the river. Like anything else, you grow up in a small town seeing certain things and taking them for granted. There was a house beside us that was run down. I don't ever remember seeing anyone enter or leave it. In the backyard, there was a car that sat outside the garage under a tarp, where you could see the taillights and the back end. It never dawned on me until I left, grew up, and learned some things. When I came back, I realized that the car that was sitting there rusting apart was a 1967 Shelby GT 500 Mustang. Like other things, you grow up thinking it was an old rusty car, not realizing until later just how special it was. There was a building a few blocks up from where we lived that we would pass on our way to the store. It never dawned on me that it was anything special. After I grew up and came back, I found out it was a mental hospital. By that time, it had already been abandoned. But with my urban explorer sensibilities, I felt the compulsion to go in and see this building that used to be so well kept, which now stood empty and deteriorating. I walked up to the corner and stopped to take in the sight of the weeds growing and windows that were boarded up. I felt like I had to see what was inside. I had looked it up online and found a few interesting articles about it, but strangely, none that went in depth. I ignored the assertion that the place was haunted. Many articles alluded to abandoned places being haunted. It increased the interest in the article and therefore the click rate. I had packed my backpack with the usual supplies and rented a hotel room on the edge of town. I parked in the parking lot and walked 3 blocks up to the building. I didn't want to have a car sitting outside the building if people got suspicious. Urban exploring can be dangerous and, in some cases, illegal, so it's usually good to keep a low profile. As I walked up to it, the detritus and weeds greeted me. The entire building was made of yellow bricks, including the staircase. This made me chuckle. First of all, wondering how in the world anyone could justify that. Even if it rained, they would get slick as snot. Secondly, my vivid imagination thought, I wonder if this is where Dorothy ended up. I started up the stairs looking for the spots that weren't about to collapse and made it to the front porch. There were some boards that looked a little dodgy, so I avoided them as I made my way around the maze of rotten wood. I finally got to the front door, which of course was locked and had a no trespassing sign on it. Any good urban explorer will tell you is more of a guideline than a rule. I shuffled my way carefully along the few good remaining boards on the porch and made it over to a boarded-up window. I pushed on the board, and it was pretty solid. So, I shuffled my way over to the other side to a board that looked like it had a small hole in it. I glanced around to make sure no one was looking before giving the moldy board a yank. It didn't come off with the first pull, but did give enough to encourage me to try several more times before finally pulling it free. I ducked as the moldy splinters that held it into the frame showered down on me. I pulled the board off and set it down, feeling a sense of accomplishment, only to be confronted by what remained of the window. I pushed the remainder of the glass out of the frame and climbed inside. What immediately struck me was the stench. It was part mold and part some type of decay. I reached into my backpack and pulled out my respirator mask and goggles. Next, I put on my gloves and snapped my body camera into place. I chuckled. Whenever I'd put these accessories on, I felt like an astronaut exploring an alien world. The dust floating past the windows lit up as rays of sunshine penetrated the room. I stepped inside and stood in what looked like a reception area. There were old pots that had once held healthy, vibrant plants, but now they were just tendrils of decay laying on the floor. There was a small reception desk that hadn't fared much better. The wood had curled up and was beginning to fall apart. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures before testing the floor down the main hallway. It seemed like the boards inside the building had fared better than those on the outside, but I knew not to take anything for granted. What looked like a sturdy board could collapse at any time, leaving me falling to an unknown fate. Every step I took made a threatening creak, but as of yet, I hadn't seen any holes in the floor. Aside from the floorboards creaking, it was silent as a tomb. It was rather unnerving. The place was on the outskirts of town, like my former home, and it was only a few blocks away from the freeway, yet I couldn't hear any noises from outside. It was like someone had placed a giant bubble over the place. As I proceeded down the hallway, I glanced into one of the rooms. It was nothing extraordinary. It had a couple of old-style hospital beds that had cranks to raise and lower the head and feet of the patient, and there were privacy screens just like you'd see in an old hospital. It had the detritus of decay, but nothing that suggested anything sinister. The newspaper article I had dug up about the place shutting down hadn't suggested anything out of the ordinary, except mere lack of funding. I came out of the room and proceeded down the hallway, continuing to treat the floorboards with suspicion. The next room held more of the same. A quick scan revealed nothing extraordinary. The next several rooms were similar. They were patient examination rooms of a very generic design. I felt like someone was watching me. I could feel their eyes boring into the back of my skull, but every time I would whip around, no one was there. I chalked it up to the creepy environment and hearing my own breath through the mask. The end of the hall presented me with a choice. There was a set of stairs that went up and down. I hesitated for a moment before choosing up. I switched on my headlight and took the stairs slowly, one at a time. Aside from the creaks, they seemed sturdy enough. I gripped the handrail tightly as I rose. When I turned the corner, I was met with an unpleasant surprise. There was a large hole in the middle of the stairs. I snapped a picture with my phone, then leaned forward and examined it closely. It didn't seem to be caused by dry rot. It looked like someone had taken a giant ice cream scoop and scooped out a perfect circle of stairs. I reached down and felt the edges. Surprisingly, they were perfectly smooth. No splinters, no rough spots whatsoever. The hole was only a foot across. There were 2 steps that were affected. I eyed the stairs above the hole, and they seemed sturdy. I thought for a long moment, calculating the risks, before I grabbed the rail, bent at the knees, then jumped. I cleared both steps, landing on the one above the anomaly, with my balance teetering for a moment until I pulled on the handrail to steady myself. That was the exact moment when the railing decided it had done its duty long enough. The screws came loose from the wall, sending me sprawling back down the stairs. I sailed over the hole, landing on the step below it and bouncing the rest of the way down to the landing. I lay there for a moment amid the cloud of dust that descended on me, checking to make sure everything still worked and nothing was broken. I rose, dusted myself off, and made a run up the stairs 2 at a time until I leaped over the hole, landing above it and continuing my momentum the rest of the way up to the top of the stairs. When I got there, I paused and turned to look back down like I had just made it up Everest. I pumped my fists in the air and spun around like Rocky on the steps of City Hall. When my foot came too close to the edge, I nearly tumbled back down the stairs. I decided I had celebrated enough. I opened the door to the upstairs hallway, and it emanated a loud creak as you'd hear in every scary movie. I wondered if that would set the tone for this floor. I stepped out into the hallway, and the first thing I noticed was movement. I froze. Something had darted into one of the rooms as soon as I stepped into the hallway. I was rapidly becoming less excited about my vacation choice, but decided it was probably a raccoon or some other animal that had made its home inside the deteriorating building. The problem was, even if that was true, a cornered animal can be dangerous. After mentally flipping a coin, I decided to continue my exploration. As tempted as I was to rewind the footage on the body cam and see exactly what it was, I pushed ahead, figuring I would find out eventually. The rooms on this floor were smaller and more comfortable. There were chairs beside each hospital bed, and there were pictures on the wall. It seemed like this was a higher classroom meant for long-term stays. I looked at one of the pictures. It was a painting of a severe-looking woman. Judging by her painting, she had never cracked a smile in her life. The next several rooms held this same pattern, the same comfort level and pictures on the wall. It was like they were surrounding the patients with the thought of these people in the pictures watching over them. It was creepy, but I guess when these rooms were in use, it wasn't common to have a television in each room. What was even creepier was the pictures had those eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you go. I swore I saw the eyes move in one of the pictures, but I was sure it was just my imagination. After experiencing a room full of glaring pictures, I passed the next several rooms with merely a glance inside. They looked the same anyway, so my anxiety justified avoiding yet another stare down. I came to the end of the hall and looked out the window. It was odd seeing the street from this point of view. As I panned around, I noticed an old man dressed in shabby clothes standing on the sidewalk. Nothing about him was particularly odd except he was staring at me. I looked twice to make sure I hadn't seen it wrong, but it was definite. He was staring directly at me. We locked eyes and something passed between us. I had the feeling this man was important. Perhaps he was somehow connected to this place. He smiled, then turned and started walking up the street. I suddenly felt like I had to talk to him. I ran to the end of the hall and bounded down the stairs. I tore down the main hallway toward the front door. In my excitement, I forgot about the weak spots in the floor and stepped on one. It instantly collapsed from under me, leaving me grasping at falling pieces of wood. I tumbled through empty air and landed flat on my back. The wind escaped me, and I struggled to breathe as I lay there in pain, looking up at the large opening in the ceiling. It was right then that I questioned my sanity for choosing this as a vacation. I was tempted to rip my mask off, but resisted the urge. Being in the basement, if that's where I was, would be the most likely place to encounter all kinds of mold and other things I didn't want crawling around inside my lungs. At the moment, I couldn't move, let alone rip my mask off. All I could do was feel the pain shooting through me and listen to the raspy breaths struggling to get into and out of my mask. I sounded a little like Darth Vader just before he died. That was a comforting thought. Seconds ticked by like they were stuck in mud as I waited for my breath to return and the pain to abate. I whiled away the time by trying to move and make sure nothing was broken. After what seemed like an eternity, I ended my evaluation by announcing to myself that the only thing truly hurt was my pride. I slowly sat up and pushed the broken wood pieces off me while panning my flashlight around this new environment. The first thing I saw was a row of old-style washing machines that had rollers to squeeze the clothes through. They were lined up against a wall that was decorated with cobwebs and looked like it had streams of rust starting where the pipes ran down the wall to the machines. As I stood and started walking, I was nearly decapitated by a rope hanging from the ceiling. In fact, there were several ropes hanging in lines. They must have been for drying the clothes when the weather was bad. I followed the hallway and found it less refined than the upstairs. The walls were made of rough-hewn wood. The rooms reminded me of coal bins. I came to an old rusty door that was partway open. I tried to stick my head in and see what was inside, but it wouldn't fit. I gave a solid tug on the door, and it opened a foot or so, but rust rained down on me. I supposed the door hadn't been opened in a while. I stepped inside and panned my light around. In the corner, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me. I backed up and bumped into the door, causing another rain of rust. The thing wasn't huge. It reminded me of an opossum or a raccoon, except it had no hair. Calling it a giant naked rat wouldn't have been too far off. The room itself appeared to be a maintenance closet. As I panned around the room, then back, I noticed the eyes were gone. That sent me into a full panic. It was bad enough knowing there was some creature down here with me, but even worse, not knowing where it was. I darted out of the room, bumping the door, but running so fast it didn't get another chance to dump rust on me. I was partway down the hall before I slowed to a stop and bent over to take a breather. As I stood there looking down, I noticed 2 ruts worn into the floor. I leaned down and touched one. It was smooth, as if worn in over a long time. I looked down the hallway and saw the ruts disappear into the darkness. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures. My curiosity dragged me after these tracks. I nearly ran down the hallway, ignoring room after room as I followed the trail. When I got to the end, the trail disappeared. It didn't fade away, it just stopped at a wall. I searched all around for the tracks to go in a different direction, but they didn't. They just ended. I remembered seeing something similar in a movie. I searched all around for something that would make the wall disappear somehow. There was nothing on the wall, no decorations or marks. I stepped back and searched the side walls, but still they were clear of any decoration or markings. Frustrated, I stepped back even further, only this time I came across a small symbol, barely noticeable on the right wall. I examined it closely, then pressed it, and nothing happened. Moment, you've made it here without hitting the like button. Come on, my friend, the listener, explode the like button and subscribe with us to continue. I will be grateful for your support. I sighed and looked around for anything else that could have been useful, but there was nothing on either side. I took another step back and looked over the entire area. The symbol was around 7 feet away from the wall. It seemed odd to have it that far away from the wall, unless... I took another look at the ruts in the floor and saw they were around 3 feet apart. The symbol was 7 feet from the wall, just the perfect size for a gurney. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I examined the symbol again. It was a crude scratching of a cross. I pressed against it again and nothing happened. As I took my thumb away, I felt it move. I pressed my thumb to it again and began to turn. To my great surprise, I was able to turn it. It kept going with no reaction. I had no idea how far I would need to turn before there was any reaction. When the cross came to the upside-down position, it stopped. I stared at the wall in anticipation, but nothing happened. I turned to start back up the hallway when I felt a soft rumbling. I turned back to see the wall sliding to the side. I darted into the open passageway, not knowing how long the door would stay open. A few minutes later, as I followed the passageway, I heard the door go shut. It wasn't until then that I realized I had no way out of this place. I went back to the now closed wall and examined it. There didn't seem to be any markings, just like the other side. I backed up a few paces and looked for a symbol when someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned to find no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stopped looking for the symbol and started quickly walking down the hall, hoping to get away from who or whatever it was that tapped me. I wasn't a huge believer in the supernatural, but I didn't discount it either. If someone wanted to get me, they would have to chase me. The flashlight mounted on my head began bouncing as I jogged away, making shadows dance across my path. Just as I slowed down and convinced myself I had been stupid to run, someone tapped me on the shoulder again. I turned around, but no one was there. This time, I didn't mess around. I took off at a full run. During the daytime outside, if someone had tapped me and no one was there, I would have just brushed it off as weird and walked away. Inside a creepy tunnel underneath what used to be a mental hospital, I wanted out. Sometimes the only way out is through. There was no way I was going back to the wall door again unless I had no choice. My mask began to fog up as my breathing became more labored from running. I had run flat out for over a minute and was winded. The mask wasn't exactly helping, but I didn't dare take it off. I had no idea how long it had been since this passageway had felt fresh air, and I had no desire to suck up lungfuls of mold and who knows what else. I slowed to a stop and fell to my knees, exhausted, gasping for air. I fought with every ounce of determination in me not to rip the mask off. In the meantime, my back sent me painful reminders of the little tumble through the floor that happened not so long ago. It took a good 10 minutes for me to recover and breathe normally. Just as I was about to get up, I felt the tapping again. This time, exhaustion won over terror. I turned to find no one there as before. I took the light off my head and shined it down on the offending shoulder, only to find the biggest spider I'd ever seen in my life sitting there. I freaked out and swatted it away, tracking it with my light. It landed light as a feather on the dirt floor a few feet away and just sat there. I stared at it for the longest time, waiting for it to leap at me and attack. But after a few minutes, it turned around and scuttled off as if it was bored. Once it was out of sight, I put the light back on my head and continued down the rough-hewn hallway. At first, I whipped around every 10 feet or so to make sure my former passenger wasn't sneaking up on me. After a few times without a trace of it, I stopped looking. As I plodded through the tunnel, I examined the walls. Aside from the occasional cobweb, there was nothing on the walls at all. This struck me as odd that there would be no lights, not even the occasional metal bracket to hold a wooden torch. It was as if whoever traversed this tunnel was on their own. I shone my light at the floor and the ruts were still there. It seemed like a long distance to travel if someone was sick and needed treatment, and it was going away from the hospital. It didn't make sense unless... Suddenly, it became clear exactly what my destination was. I was heading for the morgue. I shone my light down the middle of the tunnel, but it didn't light anything. Wherever the end was, I still wasn't close enough to see it. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but it wasn't going to be for a while. My mind held a tug of war, go forward or go back. In the end, it was the explorer in me that won out. I was here to see what was in this building, and now that I was in its very bowels, I was having second thoughts. I sighed and started forward slowly. It took a little while for my resolve to reach my legs. Once it did, my walk became a march. After a while, I saw a faint outline of something ahead. My eagerness and pace increased the closer I came. When I finally reached it, I found it was another wall. Only this time, I knew what I was looking for. I stepped back a few paces and found the symbol at eye level on the wall. I turned the cross upside down and watched as the door slid to the side. I rushed into the next room full of the excitement of discovery, only to find I was in a garbage pit. There was rot and ruin in piles. As I flashed my light around, the room seemed to be lighter than the tunnel. When I stepped in, there was a flurry of movement. Eyes that I'd seen in the first room scattered all about. I jumped when one came my way, then seemed to realize its mistake and followed others through a doorway. I resolved not to explore that room. The stench must have been horrendous because I could smell it through my mask. That worried me. If I could smell it, then it must be getting through the filters. What else was getting through the filters? I looked up and saw the ceiling of the room was much higher. There were 3 large openings above the bulk of the detritus in the room. They looked like they were some form of garbage chute. Now that the denizens of the room had fled, I looked more closely at the piles. I took a few steps toward the piles and saw white reflect back at me. I pulled out my phone and took a picture. The flash made the image clearer than my headlamp. I looked at the picture, and there, half covered in filth, was a human skull. I took an involuntary step back and scanned the rest of the pile. As I did, I saw a bone sticking out here and there. The more I looked, the more I saw. There were leg bones and arm bones, and more skulls of varying sizes. The one that chilled me to the marrow was a tiny skull no bigger than a grapefruit. I needed to get out of this room right now. I dove into the first door I came to, no longer caring if it was the same door some of the critters had gone through. I ran out of the bone room and into a different hallway. This one was made entirely of bricks. The ceiling was low and arched, with the bricks from the wall forming perfectly into the ceiling. I paused to take a breath and compose myself. How many bones had I seen? Dozens? Hundreds? I really wasn't sure. I leaned back in and took a quick picture with my phone, then got out of that room. I didn't want to think about it now, but I was sure this would be the last time I visited this place. It would only make sense to record as much as possible. It was then I remembered my body cam. I took it off its mount and checked to make sure it was still on. The power light shone green and the record light glowed red. I checked the battery and recording space and found around an hour left for my exploration. I had no desire to check the video now. I was sure I'd be seeing those critters again soon enough. But what really bothered me were the bones. Why wouldn't they just bury them? What about the families of all those people? Did they know their remains were down here in someone's basement, dumped like trash? I couldn't imagine the people of the town knew about this. There would have been a major uproar. Could this be why the place was shut down? Did someone investigate and discover it, then quietly cover it up to prevent a scandal? I looked down the brick hallway. The only way to get answers was to find them myself. And what about that old man I'd seen on the street? The way he smiled. Did he know all about this? Did he know what I would find? Had he gone to tell someone that I was creeping around in their dirty little secret? Would he send someone to stop me, or even worse, disappear me like all the people whose bones now lay forgotten in a pile of garbage? As if reading my thoughts, I heard a sound in the distance. It wasn't loud, like a stone had fallen or been kicked by someone too focused on sneaking up on me to notice it. My senses went on high alert. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a can of pepper spray. Why I didn't have it out long ago, I'm not sure. Perhaps I was too focused on exploration to be concerned about safety. A pain in my back reinforced that conclusion. I did a slow pan in a circle, looking all around the room. It was also dirty from years of disuse. I wished for more light. My headlamp was bright enough for normal circumstances, but in this underground labyrinth where light hadn't been seen for untold years, my lamp was woefully underpowered. Every time I turned, shadows jumped and danced, making my anxiety run rampant. As strange as it sounded, those small rodent-like creatures gave me hope. At least I knew there was breathable air down here. Otherwise, they would have died long ago. I wondered what they were feeding on. Cleaning the last shred of meat from bones would only last for so long. I wondered if they weren't afraid of the light, if they would have found me to be a lovely little snack. At the moment, they seemed to be satisfied with hiding, but I could feel their eyes, and I knew that if the chance came, fresh meat would be a tantalizing temptation. Perhaps even enough to overcome fear of the light. With this in mind, I did a re-evaluation of my priorities. The way back to the main part of the hospital was very far, and I wasn't sure if I could find the triggers to open the walls. Also, I wondered if my tumble into the basement had destroyed the stairs to get back up. My choices were limited. Either I start down the brick hallway or go back into the bone room. I still heard the call of exploring the unknown, but with every new danger that arose, the volume decreased. I started down the brick hallway, but slower than before. Every opening caused concern. Every sound, apprehension. The sounds were increasing by degrees, as if I was approaching the lively center of this dark and desolate place. As tempted as I was to explore rooms as they emerged, I didn't do more than pop my head in and take a picture. The quick glances showed them all to be rather similar. They were empty rooms with a drain in the middle of the floor. The doors were made of solid metal that had rusted and had a small viewport with metal bars. At the bottom of each door, there was an opening wide enough to slide a food tray in, but the rooms had no beds, no sinks, no toilets. If they were cells, they were quite inhumane. I continued down the hallway, keeping on guard for anything that might jump out at me, while at the same time being drawn by the sound. After a few minutes of walking and not seeing anything, my nerves were shot. I was so anticipating an attack that the lack of one made things that much worse. Finally, the sound got so loud I knew the source had to be right around the corner. Sure enough, I came to a turn in the hallway, and there was my culprit. Water falling from far above and splashing into a puddle on the floor. It must have been doing it for a long time, because there was an impression worn into the floor where the puddle permanently resided. It was nice to have a goal to aim for. I climbed until my arms and legs felt like jello. Finally, I felt something bump against my head. I looked up to find a trap door. I pushed against it, but it barely budged. After a few minutes of trying more desperately each time, I finally managed to push the trapdoor up enough to crawl out. As soon as I was free, it snapped back shut. I lay on the floor breathing hard from my vertical journey. After a few minutes, I gathered myself and got up to find out where I was. I looked around the room, and it seemed to be the secluded corner of a storeroom. There were shelves full of copy paper, tablets, pencils, and other standard office supplies. I went to the door and out into what looked like a modern office. There was a large desk sitting in front of a wall of old books. I looked around searching for the way out and found another door. I stepped out into the sanctuary of an old, high-ceilinged church. The windows were beautiful artworks of stained glass showing religious scenes. The pulpit was ornate, and the pipe organ was massive. I stepped down from the stage wondering at the fantastic condition everything seemed to be preserved in for an abandoned church. And then I saw the people sitting there. It wasn't a lot, only a person here and there in the pews, but at the back of the church, staring at me and smiling, was the old man. I walked down the center aisle, drawing looks from people in the pews. I pulled off my mask and smiled my most apologetic smile as I walked to the back. "Enjoy your trip?" the old man said when I got to him. "Not really," I said. "What do you know about it?" He smiled and motioned me to follow him. We went outside, and I was surprised to find the old hospital I'd broken into, what seemed like an eternity ago, in the distance and downhill from where I stood. The old man followed my line of sight. "It doesn't seem like it's that far until you walk it." He sat down on the top step, and I sat beside him. "Who are you?" I said. He sighed. "I used to work there, a long time ago," he said, pointing at the hospital. "I was the one who delivered them to the dungeon." "You knew what went on in the upper level?" He hung his head. "As much as I would love to tell you no, it would be a lie," he said. "I took them where they needed to go and put them in whatever holding room until they were called for." "And who called them?" "Who do you think?" he said, turning and looking at the front of the church. "You can't tell me that the priests—" "Of course, they did ungodly things to those people," he said with a far-off look. "You should have heard the screams, constantly, night and day." "But how could they get away with it?" I said. "There would be some paper trail, some record of people being in the hospital." "You might be surprised," he said. "This was long before humane rules were in place. If a patient came to our hospital, it was because they had done something awful, and sending them to prison would be a death sentence, or their families dropped them off because they could no longer handle them. My jaw fell open. People would just drop off sons and daughters like they were stray cats being taken to the pound. He nodded slowly. Unbelievable, I said. Is it really? Think about our modern disposable society. If it's too much trouble, get rid of it. I see your point, but this was decades ago, back when people still cared. But also, before a lot of mental illnesses were understood, people became convinced that their loved ones were crazy or even demon-possessed. So they brought them to the church, I said blankly, and the church took them with open arms, saying they would do the best they could, but never mentioning what would really happen. What did really happen? You were in the rooms. What do you think happened? I saw the torture chamber, but why? To release the sickness from their souls, he said, raising his arms theatrically. That's what the priests would have you believe. And what was the real reason? Because there are some sick individuals in this world, and some of them try to mask their sickness in the garb of a holy man. They did it for their own pleasure, I said, closing my eyes, not wanting to believe it. Among other things, such as, you saw the pentagram, I nodded. Sometimes the devil can fool you into thinking he's an angel, he said, then chuckled. Which, of course, he was at one point. His chuckle made me raise an eyebrow. Are you a religious man? Let's just say I used to be. Seeing things like that changed your viewpoint? He looked me straight in the eye. You can't imagine the things I've seen. It sent chills down my spine. So they actually performed human sacrifice rituals. But why? He shrugged. Why did you break into the hospital today? I cringed. Don't worry, I won't call the police or anything, he said. I'm just curious. I guess I wanted to see for myself. Maybe that's the same reason the priests started doing things in the basement so long ago. They were curious. Maybe... I say it allowing my thoughts to drift back to ancient times. The old man watched me with a little grin on his face. You never answered me, I said when I saw him staring. Who are you? Oh, I'm nobody who used to be somebody, he said, slowly getting up. I tried to help him, but he waved me off. That still doesn't answer my question. No, it doesn't, does it? He said with that little grin. I'll see you around, kid. And with that, he started down the hill. Can I help you, son? Came a voice behind me. I whipped around, startled, and found a little priest standing there. He wasn't very tall and had thinning gray hair. No, thanks, Father, I said. I was just talking to this old man here. What old man? He said. I looked, and the old man was gone. I stood and turned all around. There was no way he could have gotten down the hill already. It was a half-mile away. I looked to see if maybe he'd fallen, but he was just gone. He was here a minute ago. Son, I don't know how to tell you this, the old priest said. But you've been sitting out here alone for 15 minutes talking to yourself. I watched to see if you were okay. He pointed toward the church, and there was an open window that he must have looked through. That can't be, I said, mostly to myself. He smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. You wouldn't be the first to be confused about things, he said. Why don't you come back inside and we'll talk? Maybe I can help you. I looked down at the grin on his face. On the surface, it seemed friendly, but knowing what was beneath the church. No thanks, Father, I said. I think I'll go back to my nice, safe truck. I started down the hill with a fresh perspective on life. I mean, it's not every day you find out the things I have. And as for the old man, when I walked past the hospital, I looked up at the second-story window I'd seen him through. I swore I saw a fleeting glimpse of someone looking out at me. I stepped a little faster, heading for my car. When I got home and reviewed the footage from my body cam, I found the priest was right. There was no old man. I was sitting there talking to myself. There was a strange fluctuation when I would look at where the old man should have been, like heat waves in the desert. I never came back to explore my hometown. Some things are better left alone. For many years, Matt, reveled in the silence of this forest. Throughout my life, I had grown accustomed to its whispers, knowing every tree, every pathway, as well as my own fingers. I was a guardian of the forest, a person who connected with nature on a level that others could only dream of. My morning routine began with awakening to the melody of bird songs. I loved that sound. It reminded me that each new day welcomed me into the embrace of this green kingdom. After dressing, as I stepped out of my modest cabin, I was greeted by the cool morning air saturated with the scent of freshness. My work was a part of me, and I was a part of it. I monitored the condition of the forest, checked the health of the trees, and cared for biodiversity. Being a forester was not just a job for me, it was a calling. My communication with these wise trees, green leaves, and lively streams made me happy. People might have thought that such a life was monotonous, but for me, it had its own rhythm, its own harmony. This forest became my home, and I was its guardian. My days passed in tranquility, and it seemed that nothing could disturb this idyllic existence. However, fate had something in store for me that would change all my foundations, and so it began. At first, I didn't pay much attention to these strange tracks, hoping they were simply the result of some wild creature passing by randomly. However, the longer I observed them, the more they turned into a puzzle I couldn't ignore. These tracks were unlike anything I had ever seen. They were too large for foxes or raccoons and too unusual to belong to a bear. None of the animals known to me in this forest could leave such prints. My knowledge of the local fauna was impeccable, but these imprints defied the usual order. I started waking up at night, thinking about these tracks. They haunted me in my dreams, leaving a strange residue of unease. I traversed the forest back and forth, trying to find some logical explanation, but they simply didn't fit into the picture of this world. Perhaps it was some new species that I was not familiar with. I delved into my books, flipping through pages, but found nothing similar. My anxieties intensified with each passing day. It felt as if something unfathomable had penetrated this forest, casting a shadow of the unknown over it. The more I sought logic in these strange tracks, the more they became mystical. They seemed to pursue me, getting closer to my cabin. In the evenings, when the forest fell silent, I heard rustling in the bushes, and something heavy moved around, leaving behind these enigmatic traces. An unknown presence hung in the air, like a ghost you can't see but feel is there. I felt as though I were being watched, and this thought haunted me. At night, I heard footsteps around the cabin, but upon going outside, I found no one. My nerves were stretched to the limit. During the day, I tried to focus on my work, taking care of the forest, but when night fell, strange sounds and tracks returned like ghosts from the past. I began to lose sleep, and every rustle put me on edge. Fear seized me, and I realized that this was something much darker than I could imagine. Something that defied explanation in scientific terms. I knew I couldn't remain in this state of anxiety. Answers needed to be found before the shadow of this unknown completely consumed me. The night became even more ominous as strange sounds echoed around the cabin. Unidentified whispers and rustlings penetrated the darkness of the forest, as if nature itself was murmuring incomprehensible secrets to me. These sounds stirred anxiety, and my ability to discern their nature only heightened my unease. One morning, upon waking up, I noticed that the phone line connecting me to the outside world had been severed. My gaze fixated on the severed wires leading to my cabin. This was more than just strange noises in the night. Someone or something seemed to have deliberately cut my last tether to reality. Through the dense foliage of the forest, I peered, trying to discern any signs of who or what could have committed such an act. My rifle became my only ally in this struggle against the unknown. I loaded it, sensing that soon this weapon might become the last line of defense in this strange dance with the unfamiliar. Yet, even armed to the teeth, I realized that I didn't know what I was truly facing and that my cabin, once considered a refuge, was becoming a trap in something beyond my comprehension. One day, pushing through the dense foliage, I felt eyes upon me. Something unseen lurked in the forest, weaving among the trees like mist, yet I couldn't discern its distinct outlines. My heart slowed its rhythm, and I scrutinized the surrounding darkness, trying to spot the shadow standing in the shade. I continued to work, but only in the daylight. Every sound, every movement of the trees could be signs of an approaching unknown. The rifle became my guide and support. Yet, even with armed hands, I felt vulnerable in the face of this mysterious entity that seemed to observe every step I took. One day, looking up towards the impenetrable part of the forest, I noticed it. Something covered in thick, black fur, towering over 2.5 meters, with humanoid features. The gaze of the entity and mine intersected for a moment, freezing the blood in my veins. I sprinted towards my cabin, daring not to look back, and spent the entire night inside, awaiting the next day, relying solely on the sunlight, the only ally in this struggle against something that lurked in the shadows. With the dawn, as the first rays of the sun pierced through the branches, I resolutely decided to uncover what lurked in the depths of this forest. My experience as a forester and hands armed with a rifle carried confidence, but even the boldest confront the unknown. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, where even the most seasoned hunter rarely ventured. And there, amidst thick undergrowth, I saw it. It was something that defied description, a creature from the realm of nightmares. The face, flattened and covered in fur, resembled a nightmarish hybrid of a bear and a human. Its anatomy seemed grotesque and alien. A wide mouth with sharp teeth added horror to this strange being. The creature remained oblivious to my presence and continued moving deeper into the forest. My legs pulsed with determination, and I decided to follow it. At some point, I startled a nearby flock of birds, and the creature noticed me. It turned out to be even more intimidating and massive than I had thought. Now, standing before it, I realized its unnaturalness and understood that I was facing something beyond the scope of my experience. Gigantic, vivid orange eyes stared at me intensely, and I felt a chilling gaze piercing my soul. The creature was like a living nightmare, a creation that seemed out of place in this world. My resolve wavered, and terror took hold, as I realized that my rifle, once capable of handling bears, now seemed powerless against this entity. A gunshot shattered the silence of the forest, and in that moment, I felt the fate of this strange creature become inextricably linked with mine. Its cry pierced the air, filling it with an ominous echo. However, despite visible signs of pain, it did not immediately fall. Instead, the creature darted into the forest, its shadow disappearing among the trees. A mix of adrenaline and fear compelled me to run back to the cabin. Sounds echoed behind me, intensifying with each step I took. Suddenly, I realized that the creature I had shot had decided to seek revenge. Its swift footsteps drew nearer, and I could feel my body drenched in cold sweat. For long minutes, I raced through the thickets, my heart pounding furiously and my lungs burning. The sounds of pursuit became more persistent, as if the creature had transformed into an unseen force ready to engulf me. As I approached the cabin, I felt my strength draining from my legs. My gaze anxiously scanned the surroundings, trying to catch any signs that I was undoubtedly being pursued. The creature was determined not to let me go, and I knew that my life once again depended on the sole decision I could make in that moment. My legs, as heavy as stones, finally reached the cabin. With the last reserves of adrenaline, I forcefully slammed the door, creating a reliable barrier between me and the monster that was pursuing me. Yet, even through the thick wooden door, the sounds of its ominous roar penetrated. The silence in the forest was shattered by this howl emanating from the depths of the woods, filling the air with fear and apprehension. I had to make a difficult decision. Either stay in the cabin and confront something I couldn't even see or gather the last of my strength and escape. Hearing the creature beginning to break down the door, I realized I had no choice. I fired all the rounds from the chamber towards the doors, and the bullets pierced the wood with a dull, unsettling creak. The creature screamed in pain, and I heard its footsteps receding. It was only a temporary respite, and I understood that the monster would return, ready for cruel vengeance. Deprived of choices, I reloaded the rifle and sprinted in the opposite direction into the forest, seeking salvation. 15 kilometers from my cabin lay a village, my only chance for rescue. Fear consumed me, and I ran through thick thickets, feeling my life hanging by a thread. My legs, almost refusing to obey, carried me through the darkness of the forest. The sounds of the creature's enraged cries behind me emphasized that it was not intending to retreat. With each step, the darkness thickened, and I could hear the evening chorus of nature being replaced by the ominous howl of my pursuer. Exhausted and frightened, I reached the village, where the surprised and fearful residents let me into one of the houses. There, as I caught my breath, I heard an old grandmother of the village begin to unveil ancient legends about the master of the forest, a being capable of regeneration and impervious to mortal weapons. She recounted how many hunters had disappeared in this forest, attempting to hunt the master. However, having ventured into these dark lands, I had encountered it face to face and managed to survive. It was astonishing for me to learn that the creature indeed was the master of the forest, and it wouldn't let me leave so easily. That night, I realized that I had witnessed something beyond the bounds of reality, and I had managed to escape certain death. Yet this story remained in the depths of the forest, in that dark realm where the echoes of the ancient creature's howls resound, its secrets shrouded in mystery like the darkness of this enigmatic corner of the world. I'll start out by saying that I can't officially confirm what I saw, but it was as real gets for me. I don't usually think much of the supernatural, but this really changed my perspective. I'm currently 22, but I was 21 at the time this happened. I spent the summer of 2022 working in southwestern Oregon. I had taken a summer off from wildland fire for a good-paying job, baling hay for a custom hay company. It was mid-August, and they had me in a New Holland T7 260 with 2 other tractors in the field that night. We did most of our meadow hay baling at night, as you have to be careful about the moisture of grass hay when baling, or else it can spontaneously combust when stacked. I was working on the west end of the field while the other 2 tractors were on the east end, making their way towards me. It was probably around midnight or 1 a.m. I was going along, jamming out to some Creedence Clearwater Revival, when my baler got plugged. The hay had bunched up in front of the feeder drum. I was probably going too fast for the conditions or ran across a wet spot. The field was flood irrigated, so it wasn't too uncommon to find some hay that hadn't dried completely. I climbed out of the tractor to deal with the plug, pulling out handfuls of hay until the baler would take the pile. The tractor had a bunch of auxiliary lights, so the area around it was well lit. I never liked the dark, but I felt fairly safe. I was probably 2 windrows in from the edge of the field at the time. The fence lines around the field had tall canary grass growing at least 6 foot tall where the swathers couldn't get to. This had always bothered me for some reason, but I'm from eastern Washington, so I'm used to being able to see for a ways out. As I'm laying in the hay trying to unplug my baler, I heard the grass at the edge of the field moving. I looked but didn't see anything. I just figured it was an animal or something. Didn't think anything of it. After I got the baler unplugged, I hopped back into the tractor and kept going. It wasn't too long after that I happened to see a coyote at the edge of where my lights were shining. Again, I didn't think anything of it. Fast forward about 20 minutes. I see a coyote again, still hanging out just outside of the range of the work lights of my tractor. I started thinking about it, how bold it was getting that close to my tractor. Around 3 a.m., I had a shear bolt break on the baler. It's a simple fix. It's just a bolt that goes through the flywheel of the baler that's designed to break if there's too much strain on it. Kind of a safety feature to make sure you don't damage the baler itself. I went out to change out the bolt when I hear something. It sounds like a voice, but I can't quite make it out. I try and hurry up with the shear bolt replacement. As I finish up and am closing the shield on the baler, I hear it again. It kind of sounds like one of my friends who was driving one of the tractors on the other side of the field. I looked, but both sets of headlights were still moving. I was starting to freak out at this point. There shouldn't be anyone out here at 3 a.m. We're 5 miles down a gravel road from a town of like 40 people. I started rushing towards the tractor and climbed the steps. The voice is getting louder, calling my name. I get in and slam the door shut behind me. As I'm putting the tractor in gear, I look out the door. At the edge of where my lights are shining is what looks like a coyote. Something's wrong with it, though. It looks really mangy, and the eyes aren't shining the right color. They almost look crimson red. On its face is what almost resembles a smile. Then it stands up on its hind legs and tries to take a clumsy step in my direction. Once I saw this, I dumped the clutch and kept on moving. Up until the sun came up, every time I looked in the mirror, I could see a coyote staying just beyond the lights of my tractor, just like it had before. As the sun was coming up over the mountain next to us, I saw it start running back towards the tall grass at the end of the field. I radioed the other guys in the other tractors, but they didn't know what I was talking about. Thank God I didn't have a plug up or another shear bolt break after that. I don't know what I saw or heard that night, but that wasn't the last of it. Several nights later, we had gotten rained out, so I was able to sleep at night instead of during the day. It was in the bunkhouse. I was on the second floor on my bunk bed. I had just woken up around 4 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep. Once I'm up. I was laying in bed scrolling through TikTok when I heard a scratching on the window. Like I said, this is the second floor. There are also no trees near the building. It was then that I heard that same damn voice trying to mimic one of my co-workers who wasn't even in town that night. After about 20 minutes, it went silent again. That's the last I've heard of whatever that was, and I hope I never have to deal with that again. I don't know exactly what it was, but I've heard stories of similar creatures, so I wonder if it might have been a skinwalker. I grew up on the top of this mountain that was mostly abandoned since the 60s when an old ski kill burnt down. There were 2 other full-time residents up at the top where we lived. The rest of the houses stood empty the majority of the time, or were abandoned. The history of this mountain dates far back, hundreds of years ago, before the colonization of Canada. There were 2 native communities at war. One lived on top of this mountain, one lived in the valley below. At the base of the mountain, the 2 communities were supposed to meet for battle. During the journey down, the valley tribe snuck up behind the mountain tribe and slaughtered all their women and children. When the mountain tribe returned home, they were apparently slaughtered too. On the entire mountainside, these vining wild strawberries grow, and it's said they grow from the spilt blood of the mountain tribe. Many people have died on this mountain. When I was growing up, there were hundreds of old crosses littering the twists and turns up the mountain. My father later became one of those crosses. In a small meadow surrounded by trees sat a small cottage. No driveways and only an overgrown pathway to lead you to it. If you looked inside, their breakfast sat still prepared, oatmeal and eggs, untouched for years. The man that lived there was supposedly a fugitive who disappeared further into the mountains when the police came up and found him one day. We had these weird neighbors who would come 2 weekends a month from the city with their daughter who was my age. They would bring friends over, get high, drunk, and naked, and have orgies in their yard or the forest. There was this airy feeling you had while on this mountain, which was aptly named a forbidden. I stood looking out my bedroom window at night. I swear I could see things moving in the forest below. We had the highest concentration of mountain lions in the world, and I was often stalked home. One night, my mother woke to the sound of the sliding door opening and closing. She walked downstairs and my sister was standing there, sleepwalking, whispering over and over, "Here, kitty, kitty." My sister had never been a sleepwalker until this. My mother grabbed her, closed and locked the sliding door, then flicked on the lights, and right there on the deck, pacing back and forth, was a cougar. My father also became a violent sleepwalker while living up there. He would have screaming matches with the wall, sometimes ended up throwing items around. This wasn't something he did until the last few years of his life. My father was a skilled driver and had driven up this mountain and many narrower, steeper logging roads around the area many times. A few months before the accident, I started having waking nightmares of my father's death. Something was telling me he was going to die. I remember waking up frequently and looking out the window into the forest during this period and feeling like something was communicating with me that he would die. He kissed me goodnight one night and went out the door to go to town with his friends. They left in separate vehicles, him first. From the accounts of what happened, it was a freak accident. They were driving below speed limit down a straight stretch nearing a cliff corner when my dad's truck suddenly lost traction and started skidding sideways towards the cliff. My dad opened the truck door and jumped out, and the truck suddenly veered the other way and flipped onto him on the ground. Something that physically shouldn't have been possible. It crushed almost every bone in his body. He survived for 8 days in hospital after being airlifted. The day he died, I knew again. I knew he was dead, and it was like this feeling that something was communicating this to me. I didn't need to be told. I was so sure of this feeling that I collapsed onto the ground the second I got this feeling, and starting screaming, "His dead isn't he, his dead isn't he," over and over again. I was 8. I had never experienced death before. There's a lot more that went on up there to a lot of different people over the years. It's known locally as a haunted and weird place. Nothing good ever happens there. People do weird and crazy out of character things, commit heinous crimes, die, or just lose their minds. We moved when I was 9. I never felt that feeling again anywhere else. That feeling of something insidious all around you. I've only been up there a handful of times since, and every time I do that, feeling returns.